Did 9 months of trust get thrown away after 12 hours of labor? The nurse handed me my son for the first time, and my brain completely rejected what my eyes were showing me. Sarah was destroyed from 12 hours of labor, her blonde hair plastered with sweat as she reached for our baby with shaking arms. But I stood paralyzed because the child in my white hands had deep brown skin and tightly coiled black hair that looked like someone had played the cruelest possible prank on us. "Isn't he beautiful?" Sarah whispered, and I forced myself to nod, even though my throat felt like it was closing. She must have seen something in my face because her smile faltered and she said, "I know he doesn't look like what we expected, but remember what I told you about my great-great-grandfather." I did remember vaguely, some story about distant relatives with darker features, but this baby looked completely black, and my mind was racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. The next few hours were a blur of nurses checking vitals and Sarah's family bursting through the door. They'd race here for the emergency delivery while my family searched desperately for flights from Colorado. Her mother cradled our son like precious gold, and her sister kept touching his tiny fingers and saying he had Sarah's exact chin. Their pure joy made my doubts feel poisonous. Sarah watched me watching them and finally reached for my hand. "Are you okay with this?" she whispered, and her voice broke something open in me. I kissed her forehead and promised I'd be the best father this baby could have. This wasn't what we'd expected, but we were still a team. Nothing would change that. But the poison started seeping in the moment I left the hospital to grab clothes from home. My phone exploded with messages from my mother who'd seen the photos Sarah posted. "That is not your child," her text said in all caps, followed by, "I told you she wasn't good enough for our family." My best friend Jake called while I was driving and said, "Dude, I'm sorry, but there's no way. You need to get tested ASAP before you sign anything." Even my brother, who'd always loved Sarah, texted, "Man, the math isn't mathing here." By the time I got back to the hospital, my head was spinning with doubt. Sarah was nursing the baby and singing softly, looking like the perfect mother, but all I could think about was how she'd been working late so many nights during her pregnancy and how her phone was always face down on the counter. My mother called again while Sarah was sleeping and spent 20 minutes listing every time she'd caught Sarah in a lie, which were really just miscommunications, but suddenly seemed sinister. "She's played you for a fool," my mother said, "and now she's trying to pass off another man's baby as yours." The next morning I couldn't even look at the baby without feeling sick. Sarah noticed immediately and asked what was wrong, but I just shrugged and said I was tired. She tried again, reminding me about her cousin Marcus, who had similar features, even pulling up photos on her phone, but my mother's voice kept echoing in my head, especially after her text that morning, saying there were no flights left and she'd come when things were sorted out. When the discharge papers came, I told Sarah I needed air and walked out of the hospital. I sat in my car for an hour reading text after text from friends and family, all saying the same thing, that I was being scammed, that no genealogy could explain this, that I needed to protect myself. I didn't go back inside. Instead, I texted Sarah that I needed a paternity test, or we were done, then turned off my phone and drove to my buddy's house to crash on his couch. My brother caught the first flight out when I finally called him, and we spent days feeding each other's doubts while I ignored Sarah's desperate attempts to reach me. "She's probably scrambling to figure out her story," my brother said when we grabbed beers at some dive bar near. "Thank God you didn't sign the birth certificate," my mother added during one of her hourly calls, her voice full of relief, like I dodged a bullet instead of abandoned my family. When I finally agreed to meet for the test, I made sure to arrive separately and sat as far from Sarah as possible in the waiting room. She'd lost weight already and had dark circles under her eyes, but I hardened my heart against feeling sympathy. She tried to talk to me, but I pretended to be absorbed in my phone. When they called us back, I watched them swab the baby's cheek and noticed his little fingers reaching for something to grab onto, but I walked out as soon as they had my sample. The results came back positive. I was the father. Sarah sent them to me with no other message, and when I tried calling her, the number was disconnected. I drove to our apartment, but it was empty, except for my things neatly boxed in the living room. Her family wouldn't tell me where she'd gone, and eventually stopped answering altogether. That was 18 months ago. Last week I saw them at a grocery store, my son walking on unsteady legs while holding the hand of another man who was making him laugh. Sarah saw me frozen by the cereal aisle and simply turned down another row without a word. I sat in my car afterward and realized I'd gotten exactly what I'd asked for that day in the hospital. Proof instead of trust. Now I had all the proof in the world and nothing else.